Hello everyone, welcome back to LifeFit Technologies channel and thank you for watching. So this is a continuation of our Huawei Lab simulation series, and in today's episode we will be demonstrating how to implement BGP MD5 authentication on Huawei routing devices. So we know nowadays network security cannot be ignored. User data need to be protected at all costs. So you always have to factor in ways to improve network security when you are implementing networks, both for service provider and enterprise network. You also need to consider the security even when you are implementing home and office network. So one of the best practices in improving network security is by implementing authentication for protocols. That's why this episode focuses on implementing BGP MD5 authentication as a mechanism to improve network security. So you need to implement authentication for the protocol that are running on your network, be it OSPF, SIS, BGP. All these protocols support authentication. So you can configure authentication so that the messages that are exchanged between the peerings are authenticated. So in this episode, we'll be configuring MD5 authentication for TCP connections established between peers, which will help protect BGP against attacks by authenticating all the TCP messages exchanged between two BGP peers. So one best practice is to implement authentication in the entire network. You don't just have to implement it in a given segment of the network and ignore the others, but it's always recommended that you have to implement authentication at the point of connection to the external network. So as you can see in our topology, we have R1 connecting to R5, which is an external network. We also have R1 connecting to another external network, R6. So these are critical points that you need to ensure that you implement authentication. And you can also implement authentication within your AS. For example, we can implement authentication for the peering between R1 and R2, R1 and R11, just to ensure that we are improving the network security of our network. So there are some best practices that you need to follow when you are implementing authentication. First, you need to configure password in a ciphertext mode. So when you are implementing BGP authentication, you can either use plain text or ciphertext, but it's recommended that you need to use ciphertext, because if you configure in symbol text, in plain text, any user who can be able to get the configuration will be able to see the password that you've configured on the router. That is not secure enough, so it's always good practice to use the ciphertext mode. Then you also need to update your password periodically. Maybe someone leaked the password to an outsider. You need to update it so that the current password cannot be used anymore. So it will be updating the password periodically to avoid users who know the password tampering with the configuration or trying to configure BGP peering session with other external devices that are not part of our network. So when you implement authentication, MD5 authentication on BGP, as I've mentioned, there are two modes. We have the plain text mode and then we have the cipher mode. So for plain text mode, we'll be using the password and then you specify the word symbol and then you enter the password Huawei_123. For cipher mode, it's same. You need to configure peer 10.10.10.1 password, then you enter cipher. So we are selecting cipher and then the password will be Huawei_123. The password should be the same on both routers. You can't use a different password. The peering relationship will not come up. So always ensure that you are configuring same password on both ends. And you also need to implement authentication on both routers. If you just implement it on one router, the peering sessions will go down, because the routers will check the authentication parameters and they may not match, or maybe one router is sending messages that have authentication parameter, another router is sending the one without. So you always have to implement authentication on both ends of the router and use same authentication parameters. In this case, you need to configure the same password and even the mode. So if we log into one of these routers, R5, display BGP peer verbose, you can see that we have a peering session to 10.10.10.0, and currently the authentication type configured is none. So we haven't configured any authentication between these two peer. So if we were to configure authentication on one end, so as I've mentioned, it's very easy to implement authentication. This is BGP 300. If I do peer, this is 10.10.10.0, and then I specify password. As you can see, there is symbol and then there is cipher. So if I use cipher symbol and use Huawei _123, if I display this, you can see that the password is in plain text. Any user who has access to the configuration of this router can easily find the password that is configured on this router. Then they can use it to maybe configure other peerings to the external router that are not allowed to connect to the network. So it's not a best practice to use the plain text. That's why you always have to use the cipher mode. So if we just configure on one router, you can see the peering session is still up, but after 180, as you can see these timers, after the hold time timer of 180 seconds, this peering session will tear down. It will go down because one side is sending authenticated messages, another side is sending messages without authentication parameters. So there is a mismatch between them. So what we need to do, I will now disable this symbol. I will undo peer 10.10.10.0 password, and then I will now configure the cipher. So if I do the cipher and same password, Huawei _123, I display this, you can see that now the password is hashed. It's not very easy to tell the plain text password that was configured on this device, and you need to use stronger passwords when you are implementing authentication in your network. So on R1, if I display BGP peer, the peering session is still up because we are yet to complete the 180 seconds. So I need to implement BGP authentication here towards router 5. So I can just take it from my script. Cipher, we are using the cipher mode. You can see the hold time has expired, and now the BGP peering session has gone down because the exchanged messages are not merging. There is one end, there is authentication, the other end doesn't have authentication. So what I will do is to configure authentication on this end. Now I display BGP peer. We expect it to come up again. On R5, you can see the session also expired. Display BGP peer. It will take some time to come up. So our session is now established. If I do display BGP peer verbose, you can see that now authentication type configured is MD5. And if we check the messages captured between these routers, the TCP messages exchanged through the packet capture, let's see this. You can see that now we have the options: TCP MD5 signature, is coming out, a TCP option, TCP message signature. So now we have extra fields on these TCP messages exchanged between these routers on this keep alive message, and you can see the MD5 digest that is available in our Wireshark capture. So if we check the previous packets, we don't have the options field, but here down here, after configuring authentication, we now have MD5, the options field, and it's showing the authentication parameters that have been configured on the router. So this is how simple it is to implement authentication. As I've mentioned, you always have to configure password in ciphertext mode, not on symbol text, to improve on network security, and then you need to update the password periodically. So this is one of the best practices when you are running BGP on your network. Always try to implement the authentication so that to improve on the security. No one will just come, plug in a router, configure BGP, and then it will come up, unless him or her has the keys, the authentication parameter that have been configured on your network. So thank you for watching again. Please feel free to leave your comments in our comment section, to like our video, and also to subscribe to our channel, as we will be covering more content on BGP in our subsequent videos. Thank you.